When times are tough in the whiskey industry, a lot of pressure falls on the shoulders of innovation departments of whiskey brands, sitting in their Q1 meetings being told by the brand VP that the reason not enough people are buying the whiskey is because the brand needs an urgent facelift to include a more neutral Pantone to appease Gen Z drinkers. And on top of that, the insight team has just told them that non-alcoholic wine casks are the next big trend for finishing whiskey in. But with hundreds of new whiskey bottlings being released every single year, for whiskey drinkers, it becomes a bit of a case of decision fatigue when it comes to their favourite whiskey brand in terms of the consistency of the brand's style and identity. It's a little bit like how Irn-Bru went from having one sacred recipe for over 100 years to all of a sudden having 11 different limited releases and flavours, including unicorn tears and ice cream flavour, which I'm sure tastes great, but it's a bit like graffitiing the girders which Irn-Bru has been founded on. So where your beloved whiskey brand had some really identifiable core ranges and age statements and some really well thought out limited releases, it suddenly turned into absolute flavours, and you know full well that all those exotic cask finishes are just trying to shift all the excessive inventory that's been amassed since lockdown. But of course, winning over the next generation of whiskey drinkers has never been more paramount. So how exactly do whiskey brands effectively innovate and evolve to go with the flow of the change of the consumer tide, while also staying true to their brand legacy, heritage and fan base? And so for a whiskey brand to decide it's time to innovate, it could be for any number of reasons. And much of the time, the decision makers that are steering the big whiskey brands have carved out their career marketing craft beer, shampoo, beauty products and soft drinks, where they've learned to appease their brand promiscuous consumers with a flurry of new releases. And so the same logic tries to get applied to the slowest reacting spirit category of all time. But throughout whiskey history, true innovation has always driven the industry forward, whether it was the creation of the coffee still in 1830, or the advent of the Johnnie Walker square bottles to prevent breakages during shipping, or the pioneering of cask finishing in the 1980s by David Stewart MBE at the Balvenie. And of course, the decision-making process for the next innovation for a whiskey brand or distillery depends entirely on a few things like how many markets the whiskey is available in, the size and ownership structure of the brand or distillery, and of course the time frame that stands between concept and execution. And from that, you could have a very successful idea which changes the legacy and perception of a whiskey brand, or you could just end up with some absolute fizzlers. Releases such as Jane Walker of the Glenlivet cocktail capsules, Fishkey and Loch Lew's Black Whiskey spring to mind in that sense. And quite often it feels like the big whiskey brands are trying to behave a bit like independent bottlers who have far greater agility at getting out limited cask releases for their customers because that is what their business model is. And for newer whiskey brands and distilleries, they arguably have the ability to take much greater risks when it comes to innovation because they don't have a 200-year legacy global distribution network or legacy fan base to worry about. But either way, the big question becomes, is that next idea or innovation necessary, or is it just something to give to the industry media to chew on and make headlines with? Has the term innovation just become a label for what is effectively just brand housekeeping, where you just update the core range or the logo every 5 to 10 years? So in a world of constant new news with Gen Z apparently not drinking enough and other spirit categories having more dynamic offerings and occasions, it's clear to see why as a whiskey brand you want to innovate in a certain direction. However, the question becomes, does innovation become a crutch at that point and stop addressing the real issues why we can't win over the next generation of whiskey drinkers into the category? I've always thought the best innovations solve a legitimate problem, and in 2026 there are certainly no shortage of those in the whiskey industry. As always guys, thanks for tuning in. Let me know what your thoughts are on the state of whiskey innovation in the comments below. Cheers.